So I will continue what I started saying in the introduction, but on a more empirical basis. I'm the first speaker to discuss the results of our joint research, which Oleg already mentioned. So this is just some info about this research. We've done more than 200 interviews at the rallies, and this material is now collected, analyzed, and there will be many talks in this conference based on this data. So mine is just the first, certainly not the most authoritative. To connect with the civil society topic, as I said, any civil society has this challenge of atomization and re-association, and civil society in Russia is, of course, a very good example of this. In the 70s and 80s, it was in a way similar to the Eastern European societies I have already evoked, in that there were many informal associations, self-organizations, usually of non-profit, non-economic character, and which constituted some vague opposition, vague criticism of Soviet state, but of course no one would expect that they would actually unite into a revolution, which eventually happened in the late 80s. But under the perestroika, during the end of 80s and early 90s, there was really a boom of self-organization, so the civil society in the standard sense of the word was at its peak. Also because it was given a political channel of expression, and there was no clear limit between the civil organization and political organization. It was, as some people distinguish between civil society and political society, and political society is not the state, so this would be the political society developing during the perestroika. But after this movement won in 91, there was what I call a negative revolution, an implosion of the society. So instead of further development of civil society, of associations and organizations, etc., in fact, there was a collapse driven by many factors. One of them, of course, is the need is the privatization and the need to gain profits from your associational activity, and therefore competition, private interests, fragmentation of interests, etc. As I already said, capitalism, at least in its neoliberal form, actually consisted in the withdrawal of political interest and of interests of unity from economics. And therefore, the economic relations were depoliticized and run by the egotistic or group egotistic interests. This led to a large-scale anomia and a crisis of the civil society. The values, all the value surveys, for example, consistently show that Russian people are on the top of egotistic materialist interests in the world, with very low collective, universal and altruistic values. This tendency was supported in the years 2000 by the state. When Putin came to power, he took direct, deliberate measures to depoliticize the civil society even further. To dissolve the existing organizations and to destroy the public sphere, particularly by monopolizing the media and withdrawing any sense of political discussion from these media. But at the same time, there were other tendencies throughout this period, which also relate to civil society. On the one hand, the political economic change in Russia was the post-40s, post-industrial transformation, which led to to the shift in the occupation, labor, and status of urban class, of the urban intellectuals. Well, intellectuals in the broad sense of the word, because they commonly became managers, small clerks, creative workers at the multiple media and design agencies, etc., etc. So the higher education, the cognitive, communicative, and organizational skills were now much more demanded by the economy, while the traditional industries, of course, withdrew from the major cities, particularly from Moscow. So this is a very important tendency that prepared what we now observe, although originally, of course, it was not, it didn't lead directly to the rise in civil society. At the same time, in the years 2000, we had the proliferation of the local protests, which were quite numerous, and Karine Clément has just described them. But the country became to repoliticize roughly since 2008, so since the shift from Putin to Medvedev. Medvedev led a soft liberalization, and this also contributed. So there were things like March Nesoglasных, March of Dissenters, there were nationalist riots in this period, which were also quite numerous. But interestingly, the state responded to this very ambiguously. On the one hand, it continued its policy of propaganda of consumption and depoliticization. At the same time, there was more and more seriousness in the promotion of patriotism, of civic values, this discourse about civil society, about Russia. There was a patriotic mobilization, particularly around the Georgian War. There was constant talk about democracy, which was supported by the high approval ratings of Putin. So supposedly, since the approval rating is high, we have a democracy. That was the official line. It still is. The results of Irina Soboleva present here show that in the recent rallies, both among Putin supporters and opponents, democracy was one of the highest signifiers, highest values, not democracy as such, but the word democracy was very popular, which is indicative of, again, of the official line on this issue. And so this all taken together created the basis for the protests of 11-12 or 11-13, if you want to call them such, which are commonly called protests for fair, movement for fair election. You know more or less the storyline. There was a parliamentary election, which was commonly seen as fraudulent, and suddenly there were numerous rallies that were spontaneous, mostly attended by the observers at the election, and then there was mass mobilization for the rallies that reminded those of perestroika. But after a series of rallies and mass mobilization, actually Putin was still elected president, and the studies show that even though there was probably fraud, still the majority would have elected him in the first round, and then started the aforementioned repressions. So the issue that interested me was the self-understanding of the protesters, their identity. It was obviously not an identity-driven movement like the new social movements often were. Like it was not a movement that was saying, we are all gay, please recognize us, or recognize the women, or recognize the Catalans, etc. Nothing like that. There was not even an emphasis on the we, on the subjectivity of the protesters. But at the same time, there was a widespread feeling that the people who gathered at the square had something in common. And our interviews show that very commonly people are saying that the main thing why I'm here is to see the people who think and look like myself. And I didn't know that we were so numerous. So, as Oleg rightly said, there was a moment of self-consciousness, although absolutely unclear of whom, but of someone. And so, of course, there were speculations about who that was. Creative class was commonly discussed in the media because of the well-known book by Richard Florida. And of course the middle class was discussed. It's not only a scholarly term, but it's also a mediatic term, which certainly was available for the definition of these protests. But of course it's too large. The majority of the Russian middle class, if we take income and way of life, did not go to the rallies, and probably the majority voted for Putin. According to the polls, this is true. Moreover, when asked, the protesters didn't support this middle class identification, and rather preferred to say that it's not about us, it's about the government, it's about Putin who is evil, it's about the fraudulent election, it's about the repressive state. As one blogger, well-known intellectual, rightly expressed the feelings of many protesters, we are resistance, not an opposition. So it was a reactive, not a proactive position. But what do we have in terms of identity in our interviews? There are mentions of middle class and creative class. Actually, quite many of them, 38 interviews of 165, so about 26%. But there is even more numerous self-qualification. At least numerous in terms of singular mentions. In terms of interviews, it's less numerous than middle class, but still very significant. It's the self-identification as the people, in Russian, narod. In Russian, it sounds a little stronger than in English. It's the das Volk kind of thing. And Russia, of course, has a long tradition of populism. The very concept comes from Russia, from the 19th century Russia. And I even tried to determine very roughly in what sense the people was used, because Margaret Canavan identifies three main meanings. You can say of the people as the sovereign, like saying, we are your electors, please be faithful to the constitution. So that would be the liberal meaning. The people as this abstract entity. There is an obvious nationalist understanding of the people, the Russian people. And there is a social understanding in the sense that people are everyone who is not the government, and everyone who is, not distinguished by some privileges. Of course, the social meaning is harder to tackle, but roughly we can assess that the social meaning was used, and actually that the social meaning was predominant. So it was the simple people against the authorities. I also used the so-called PEPS database generously provided by Misha Gabovich, present here, the author of the most important book on the protest that appeared by now. And Misha collected about 8,000, right? 8,000 signs or posters, slogans from the protests, not only from Moscow and St. Petersburg, but from around Russia. Actually, this is the difference, because our data is mostly from Moscow and St. Petersburg, and this data is across country, throughout the country. But what this database shows is that middle class is not mentioned a single time in these slogans. There were no slogans, middle class against Putin. However, there were 222 mentions of narod, the people, about 3% of the total of the slogans. And again, a rough estimation shows that the predominant meaning was social, like we, the simple people, come to the street against you. Liberal and nationalist slogans were in the minority. So here is an example, a quote from one of the informants. What do you expect? That the society and state will change, that power will be with the people. Corruption means that the government considers people as a senseless scum, that one can take people's money and use for their purposes, and the people are just a material to spend. So not only this is an intellectual who identifies with the people, but also the word scum that is often used by the educated class of Russia to refer to the simpler, less educated people here is a self-description. So it's referred to the protesters themselves, including the intellectuals. And I skip a part on Navalny, who is a characteristically populist politician. But to conclude, I will just say that this seems to be a common tendency in the wave that Jack mentioned. In the certainly Russian protests were part of this global wave, and everywhere there were middle-class intellectuals coming to the street and saying that we are the 99%, as in America, which is a paradoxical. Of course, they are not 99%. But this is a rhetorical claim. It's a bet. It's a political bet for the future, which of course is very powerful. Wendy Brown rightly says that Occupy is in principle a populist movement. And Gayatri Spivak, another very important American intellectual, says that we are witnessing a subalternization of middle class. Again, Gramsci. So the middle class is no longer an elite. It feels itself as the people, yes, the oppressed, the exploited, the marginal, etc. Whether it's true or not, but this is the self-understanding. So we are witnessing a paradoxical populism, a populism of new type, which I call a middle-class populism. Roughly, of course, maybe there is no middle class, but something like middle class does not identify itself as middle class, but identifies itself as the simple people, while the simple people in the case of Russia doesn't support them, if we take the numbers. So this is a paradox, and of course it reflects the double position of these intellectuals in the economy, which is both the traditional position of an elite and of someone who has universal outlook, and of someone who is a wage laborer and is absolutely dependent and not autonomous in economy. This paradox, I think, creates this strange identification of middle-class populism, which is certainly, I think, a new political phenomenon to stay with us for the future, and maybe to have some political victories. Thank you.
Thank you, Artem.
I have many questions, but some of them are repeats for personal conversations. I think it's very interesting, your research. I have questions about the depoliticizations of capitalism, because I think capitalists attempt at the depoliticized relationship, but different forms of capitalism work in different ways. So for this type of capitalism relies on the states, tended to the contrary, politicized type of economic relations.
Corporatism, yes.
And neoliberal capitalism, indeed, everywhere tends to depoliticize, attempt at depoliticize, but very often the message is not working because it is so evident that neoliberalism needs the state in order to support it. So this tension, I think, is interesting, and I wanted to ask to which extent did you find these strategies and counter-strategies, the states trying to demobilize and depoliticize, and the movements trying to repoliticize? This is one question. Another question is about the tensions between working class and intellectuals, middle class, and so on, which I found similar in my research in 1989. in DDR or in Hungary, the type of oppositions was not an opposition by the unions. And it was related with the role that the communist parties, the socialist party or whatever what is called, played during the development of the regimes. This was very different in 2011 in the Arab Spring, where protests instead bridged since the very beginning social issues and political issues. And I was wondering to which extent also in Russia there is a legacy of the past regimes.
Yeah, thanks. These are very good questions. I will start with the second one. Actually, during the perestroika, it was very different from now, in the sense that liberal intellectuals managed to gain hegemony in very different sectors of the society, particularly among workers. And of course, it's common knowledge that the miners actually organized huge strikes in mostly 1990, 91. And apart from their direct economic demands, they asked for the market economy. They were saying, please liberalize the economy and so that we get the proper wages, which of course was the most stupid thing you could imagine, but they believed, they trusted in the propaganda of the hegemonic bloc, which was of course mostly middle-class intellectuals from the cities. Also, part of the party nomenclatura supported the protesters. They, unlike the miners, were very rational because they understood that this is a chance for them to accumulate wealth. And to secure their positions. So that moment was really a revolutionary moment in this sense. There were several slogans, also anti-corruption, some populist elements, but some of them neoliberal, because it was also a neoliberal wave throughout the world at that time. And they all gathered momentum and led to a revolution. Here, of course, we don't have anything like this, and what Karin said was very interesting, and part of what is interesting is that all these people, well, most of the people, it's an empirical question, but probably they do not participate in the protests of this last 2 years, right? So people who came to the streets in 2005 are probably not there now. Well, that's my guess. Some of them maybe are, but well, some leave. There were certainly activists who are always at the streets, but the social composition is different. And I hear the claim of Misha Gabovich, who is in his book also, he proves that there was no clear social portrait, no social profile of these people. They were very diverse. Well, everyone is always very diverse, but we all consist of many electrons. But there are some historical forces that are more or less distinct. Yeah, we can distinguish them. So I would agree very roughly that something like educated urban class is maybe more active, more hegemonic, even though there are many different people. So if there is a hegemony reached, I think there is a good chance. Actually, what happened in Soviet Union in the 70s is that first of all, intellectuals became liberal suddenly. They used to be communist, and then they became liberal. And then they had 15 years, and during 15 years, they agitated. They had a successful propaganda throughout the society. That way, they reached hegemony. They had 15 years. If now we count 15 years from now, then maybe the whole people will rise against Putin or his successor in 15 years. But I don't know if it happens soon. As for the first question, okay, well, I fully agree with you. It was a simplification, actually sent back to Marx, who says before any neoliberalism. He says in the Jewish question that, what is the capitalist civil society? It's the result of the revolution that depoliticized the civil society, unlike the Middle Ages when it was politicized. But then the Fordist, of course, was a socialist reaction against this. And now the neoliberalism led to the double situation that I described, that on the one hand there is a tendency to withdraw from the society and to let the society do whatever it wants to do. On the other hand, this very approach paradoxically includes some calls to build a more active civil society, because the state doesn't want to deal with many things with which it previously had dealt. Alexander Filipov, present here, has a very good argument on this, on the police issue in Russia. I'm sure he will tell this to us. Are there urgent questions? Lena, maybe, yeah.
Actually, we got a question about the so I found it really interesting that you include now the politics and policies of the Russian state towards civil society in the 2090s. And I don't know whether you really reflect, so what was the role of this policy, but if you will analyze it and if you would like to take it into account, you should see that actually this policy of promotion of civic values and civic and moral values, like you say, it started actually not in 2008, but much earlier, already in the beginning of 2000s, because firstly it was a policy towards civil society organizations during the Civil War, and especially in 2004 after the terrorist attack in Islam, when actually Putin and then the whole elite started to speak about civil society, but actually, and the need to have civil society in the fight against terrorism. But actually what they meant under civil society was not, for example, NGOs or civil initiatives or something like that. They just meant the whole society. The whole Russia, just ordinary citizens and society who should help the state. So actually in this time they tried to redefine civil society term, and I think that's actually important and to some extent also important for understanding that appeals of in 2011, 2012, when people said we would like to have civil society. Civil society is we are civil society, and not.
So they had the populist understanding of civil society, actually. Interesting.
An answer to this policy, and I think that's important to take into account. And I have actually analyzed that and really.
Do you have something on this? Probably.
Yeah.
I have to read.
Last question.
These are two questions, but very short. One is about this new populism that you spoke of, which, if we take Margaret Canavan's definition of speaking on behalf or in terms of the people, using that discourse, yes, we do have a lot of discourse, about the people, but would you care to comment about the connections, the more organic connections of the protest movement to actual populations, and to what extent they were truly representative of that population? So, it's opposed to a more discursive understanding of populism. I urge you to comment on the more organic. Well, my other question is about, I very much appreciated that you discussed protest or identity in terms of self-description, because there is a huge media machinery that's invested in imputing identities and narratives on those protesters, but not being, and so to me, the narrative of the middle class protest is a product of that media machinery, but not being from Russia, I do not fully understand how that media machinery works in this context, and what are the different kind of narratives that are being imposed on what is a very heterogeneous mass of protesters.
Well, I mean, on the second question, well, it's a huge question. How does the media work? Maybe in some other talks we will return to that. But generally, yes, there was in the main channels of TV, in the newspapers, there was a discourse that these are protests. Yes, interesting that people rebel, but look at them. Like, look at these people, you see that they are not like you, they are obviously quite affluent, and this is intelligentsia again, and basically they want to be like the West, and they are fed by the West, and etc., etc. Which was persuasive. I mean, these people do look westernized. On your first question about organic populism, but you see, I mean, the very point of Canavan or of Laclau is that populism can only be discursive in a sense, because it's a coalition of very diverse forces which do not have an organic connection. It is organic in the sense that there are some groups that actually are discontent with something and they want to revolt, but to unite all of them and to build some kind of agenda, it's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to build a concrete organic identity. This is why it is sometimes called rhetorical. Yes, populism is rhetorical, but what do you do? What is not rhetorical? And Laclau's and Canavan's point, which I'm very sympathetic with, that politically we should rehabilitate populism. Populism was used as a pejorative word for some very bad reasons. I mean, for the counter-democratic intentions.